The smell of expensive cedar and floor wax was suddenly choked out by the sharp metallic scent of gunpowder and burning gasoline. Elena was in the nursery, folding tiny silk onesies, when the first explosion rocked the villa. The floor groaned beneath her feet, and the crystal chandelier above the changing table swayed like a pendulum. She didn't have time to wonder what was happening. She already knew. In the world of Dante Moretti, peace was just a countdown to the next war. From the hallway, she heard the frantic clicking of designer heels on the marble floor. Elena rushed to the door, pulling it open just as Sophia, Dante's wife, ran past. Sophia wasn't headed for the nursery. She was clutching a Birkin bag and a handful of jewelry cases, her eyes wide with a cold, animalistic terror. "Sophia, the babies!" Elena shouted, her voice cracking. Sophia didn't even look back. "The security teams are dead, Elena. If I stay, they'll kill me to get to Dante. I have to go." "But the twins, save yourself!" Sophia screamed over her shoulder as she vanished down the service stairs toward the private garage. A moment later, the roar of a high-performance engine echoed through the courtyard, followed by the screech of tires. The mother of the heirs had fled, leaving her children behind like discarded luggage. Elena didn't hesitate. She lunged for the cribs. Leo and Mia were already screaming, their small faces turning a frantic shade of red as the smoke began to curl under the nursery door. The heat was rising, a physical weight pressing against her lungs. She grabbed Leo first, tucking him against her left hip, then scooped Mia up with her right arm. They were heavy, their little limbs flailing in a panic that matched her own heart. "I've got you," Elena whispered, though she could barely hear herself over the sound of shouting men and shattering glass downstairs. "I've got you." The main staircase was a wall of fire. She could hear the heavy thud of boots, men who weren't Dante's men. They were calling out in a language she didn't recognize, their voices rough and hungry. She knew the layout of the estate better than anyone. She had scrubbed every inch of it for 3 years. She knew the safe room wasn't just a closet. It was a reinforced vault hidden behind the library's false mahogany paneling. She sprinted down the back servants' corridor, her simple uniform catching on a stray splinter. A bullet whizzed through a window to her left, showering her in glass. She squeezed the twins tighter, shielding their bodies with her own as she dove into the library. The room was dark, the air thick with the smell of old books and impending death. With a trembling hand, she reached behind the third shelf and found the hidden pressure plate. The heavy wood groaned and slid back, revealing a cold, steel-lined door. She scrambled inside just as the library door was kicked off its hinges. Elena hit the emergency close button. The steel door hissed shut, sealing out the screams, the gunfire, and the heat of the fire. In the sudden, oppressive silence of the vault, Elena collapsed onto the reinforced floor. Her lungs burned, and her arms ached from the weight of the children. Leo and Mia were sobbing softly now, exhausted by the terror. Elena pulled them into her lap, rocking them in the pitch-black room. She was just a maid, a woman whose name Dante Moretti usually forgot 10 minutes after she left the room. She had no gun, no money, and no way out. But as she sat there in the dark, listening to the muffled thuds of the world burning outside, she knew one thing. She was the only thing standing between the Moretti legacy and a shallow grave. The smell of charred wood and spent gunpowder was still thick in the air when Dante Moretti stepped through the wreckage of his front door. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt stained with blood that wasn't his own, and his eyes were as cold as a winter grave. He had spent the last 2 hours tearing through the city, hunting the men who had dared to strike his home while he was away at a meeting. Every security detail at the gate was dead. Men and the grand staircase was nothing but a blackened skeleton of marble and ash. He didn't care about the house. He didn't care about the millions of dollars in art melting off the walls. His heart felt like a jagged piece of glass in his chest as he shouted for his children. There was no answer, only the sound of a settling beam groaning under the weight of the debris. He had already received the report that Sophia's car had been spotted miles away at a private airfield. She had made it out, alone. Dante pushed through the library doors, his boots crunching on broken glass and shredded books. The room was a tomb. He looked toward the hidden panel behind the mahogany shelves, his hand trembling as he reached for the trigger. He expected to find his children alone, terrified, or worse. He didn't expect the door to hiss open and reveal a woman who looked like she had walked through hell to get there. Elena was sitting on the floor of the vault, her back pressed against the cold steel wall. Her simple gray maid's uniform was torn at the shoulder, and her face was streaked with soot and dried tears. In her arms, Leo and Mia were fast asleep, their small heads tucked into the crook of her neck. She was shielding them with her entire body, her arms locked around them so tightly that her knuckles were white. When the light from the library hit her eyes, Elena flinched, pulling the babies closer. She looked up, squinting against the glare, her breath coming in ragged hitches. When she realized it was him, the tension didn't leave her body. Instead, she looked at him with a fierce, eye-protective glare he had never seen on a servant's face before. "They're safe," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. They didn't hear a thing after the door closed. Dante stood frozen. He knew this girl. He had seen her 100 times carrying laundry baskets or polishing the silver in the dining room. He had never spoken more than 2 words to her, and he certainly hadn't expected her to stay when the bullets started flying. His own wife had fled the moment the first alarm tripped, but this girl with no title and a low wage, had stayed in the line of fire. He stepped into the vault and knelt beside her. The movement was slow, almost reverent. He reached out to touch Leo's cheek, his large, scarred hand shaking slightly. The boy stirred but didn't wake, kept calm by the steady rhythm of Elena's heartbeat. Dante looked at Elena, really looking at her for the first time. He saw the bruises on her arms where she must have hit the floor, and the way she refused to let go of his children even now that he was here. "Sophia is gone," Dante said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know," Elena replied softly. She didn't ask where or why. She just looked down at the twins. "I couldn't leave them, Mr. Moretti. They were so scared." Dante reached out not for his children, but for Elena's hand. He wrapped his fingers around hers, feeling the heat of her skin against his cold palm. He felt a strange, heavy shift in his chest. Everything in his life was built on power, fear, and transactions. But here was something he couldn't buy. Absolute, selfless loyalty. "You saved the only things that matter to me," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. He didn't thank her. In his world, a thank you wasn't enough. He stood up and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet while she still cradled the twins. He watched as she leaned into him for support, her small frame trembling with exhaustion. As they walked out of the ruined library and into the moonlight, Dante knew things would never go back to the way they were. He wasn't just taking his children back. He was taking the woman who had saved them. She had been a ghost in his house for years. But starting tonight, she was the most important person in it. The temporary safe house was a glass and steel fortress perched on a cliffside, a sharp contrast to the smoke and ruins of the old estate. Elena sat on the edge of a plush velvet sofa in the nursery, her hands trembling as she smoothed the hair of the sleeping twins. She still wore the torn, soot-stained uniform from the night before. Every time a door clicked or a floorboard groaned, she flinched, her eyes darting to the heavy oak entrance. She felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, waiting for someone to tell her it was time to go back to her cramped apartment in the city. The door swung open, and Dante Moretti stepped in. He had changed into a fresh black shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of tattoos crawling down his forearms. Behind him, a line of 10 men in suits stood at attention, their heads bowed. These were the elite guards, the men paid millions to ensure the Moretti bloodline remained untouched. Dante didn't look at the twins. He looked at the men, His voice was a low, terrifying growl that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. He told them they were failures. He told them that a girl with a mop and a bucket had done more to protect his legacy than their high-tech sensors and automatic weapons ever had. With a single sharp flick of his wrist, he dismissed them. He told them if he ever saw their faces on his property again, they wouldn't live long enough to regret it. The guards filed out in a panicked silence, leaving the room heavy with the scent of Dante's cold fury. Elena stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt small in the shadow of his presence. She cleared her throat, her voice barely a whisper. She told him she should probably go now, that she needed to check on her own place, and perhaps he had a professional nanny on the way. Dante stepped closer, his shadow falling over her and the cribs. He told her she wasn't going anywhere. He explained that trust was the only currency he valued, and right now, his vault was empty of everyone but her. He looked down at Leo and Mia, then back at Elena. He said that from this moment on, there would be no more nannies, no more rotating staff, and no more strangers. He pulled a thick stack of papers from his pocket and tossed them onto the coffee table. It wasn't a standard employment form. It was a contract that looked more like a treaty. He told her she was being promoted. She was no longer the maid who scrubbed his floors. She was the sole guardian of his children. He offered her a salary that made her head spin, more money in a month than she had seen in her entire life. But there was a catch, and she could see it in the way his dark eyes locked onto hers. He told her she would live where he lived. She would eat when he ate. She would be under his protection 24 hours a day. She wouldn't be allowed to leave the grounds without his personal escort. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a gilded cage. Elena looked at the papers, then at the twins. She thought about the fire and the way Sophia had run without a second thought. She thought about how the babies had reached for her the moment they woke up. She knew Dante wasn't a good man, but he was a desperate father, and that made him the most dangerous man she had ever met. She picked up the pen. Her hand shook, but her gaze stayed steady. She asked him what happened if she said no. Dante leaned in, his face inches from hers, the scent of expensive cologne and danger surrounding her. He told her he wouldn't let her say no. He told her the twins needed her, and more importantly, he wasn't finished with her yet. Elena signed her name at the bottom of the page. As the ink dried, she felt a strange chill. She had saved the children from the fire, but she had just walked into a different kind of flame. She was no longer an invisible servant. She was the most protected woman in the city, and she belonged to the boss. The new reality of Elena's life felt less like a promotion and more like a sentence. The glass fortress was beautiful, but the silence in the hallways was heavy with the presence of armed men she didn't know. Every time she looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, she saw black SUVs idling at the perimeter. She was no longer scrubbing floors, but her hands still shook when she prepared the twins' bottles. The memory of the fire and the whistling sound of that bullet in the library played on a loop in her mind. She wasn't a soldier or a bodyguard. She was a woman who just wanted to survive. One evening, after Leo and Mia had finally drifted off to sleep, Elena walked down the long, dimly lit corridor to Dante's private study. She found him sitting behind a massive desk of dark wood, a single lamp casting long, jagged shadows across his sharp features. He was looking at a digital map of the city, his face set in a mask of calculated aggression. He didn't look up when she entered, but she knew he felt her presence. Elena cleared her throat, her fingers knotting together. She told him she couldn't do it. She explained that she had seen the news. The men who attacked the old estate hadn't been caught yet. And she told him she was terrified every time she heard a car door slam or a radio crackle. She wasn't built for this world of shadows and steel. She told him she wanted to go back to her old life, to her small apartment where the only thing she had to worry about was the rent. She offered to train a real nanny, someone with experience in high-risk environments, and then she would slip away quietly. Dante finally looked up. His eyes weren't filled with the warmth he showed the children. They were cold, obsidian voids. He stood up slowly, his tall frame cutting a silhouette that seemed to swallow the light in the room. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked around the desk, his movements fluid and predatory, until he was standing directly in her personal space. The air between them grew thick and hot. He told her that her old life didn't exist anymore. He explained that the moment she walked out of that burning nursery with his heirs in her arms, she became a target. If he let her walk out his front door, his enemies would snatch her up within the hour to find out where he was hiding. He wasn't being cruel, he said. He was being practical. To the world, she was now the most vulnerable piece on his chessboard. Elena felt a surge of panicked rebellion. She told him she didn't care about the money or the contract. She told him he couldn't just keep her there against her will. She turned to leave, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but Dante's hand shot out, gripping her arm. It wasn't a violent hold, but it was absolute. It was the grip of a man who never lost what he decided to keep. He pulled her back toward him until she could feel the heat radiating off his chest. His voice dropped to a low, velvet growl that sent shivers down her spine. He reminded her of what she had done. He told her she had chosen this the moment she risked her life for his blood. He said that in his world, you don't get to save a Moretti and then just walk away. You saved them, he whispered, his face inches from hers. And because you did, you are no longer just a girl from the streets. You belong to this house, you belong to them, and you belong to me. Elena looked up at him, her breath hitching. She saw the darkness in him then, the possessive, territorial streak that made him the most feared man in the city. He wasn't just protecting her, he was claiming her. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a terrifying tenderness. He told her she would stay, she would be safe, and she would never want for anything again, but she would never leave his sight. He let go of her arm, but the weight of his words felt heavier than any physical restraint. Elena backed away, her legs feeling like lead. She realized then that the contract she had signed wasn't just for a job. It was a deed. She was the golden bird in a cage of bulletproof glass, and the man who held the key was never going to let her go. The storm outside the glass fortress was a mirror of the chaos Elena felt inside. Thunder rattled the reinforced window panes, sounding too much like the explosions from the night of the fire. In the nursery, the air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus and the heavy, rhythmic sound of labored breathing. A seasonal fever had swept through the house, hitting the twins with a vengeance that their tiny bodies weren't prepared for. Leo was wailing, a high-pitched, exhausted sound that tore at Elena's nerves, while Mia lay unnervingly still, her face flushed a deep, hot crimson. Elena hadn't slept in 36 hours. Her hair was a messy knot, and her sweater was damp with spilled apple juice and tears, but she didn't feel the fatigue. Every time she tried to lay them down in their cribs, their cries reached a fever pitch, their small hands clutching at her shirt as if she were the only solid thing in a world of shifting shadows. She sat on the floor between the two cribs, pulling both infants into her lap. She rocked them gently, humming a low, wordless melody her own mother had sung in the cramped apartment of her childhood. She felt Leo's forehead against her neck, the heat of his fever radiating into her skin. She didn't have the medical training of the elite doctors Dante had summoned earlier that day, but she had something they didn't: a bond forged in fire. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice cracking from exhaustion. "I'm right here. The fire is gone. The bad men are gone. I won't let go." In the doorway, hidden by the deep shadows of the hall, Dante stood motionless. He had come to check on the progress of the fever, his mind usually occupied by the logistics of retaliation and security. He was a man who understood power, bloodlines, and territory, but he had never truly understood the concept of a mother's heart. He watched as Elena leaned down, kissing Mia's sweaty brow and then Leo's, her movements filled with a desperate, selfless tenderness. He had seen Sophia hold the children for photos or during formal events, but it had always looked like a performance. There was no performance here. Elena looked exhausted, broken, and small, yet she was holding the weight of his entire world in her arms without a single complaint. He watched her hand tremble as she wiped a tear from Leo's eye, her own eyes closed in a silent prayer for their recovery. For the first time in his life, Dante felt a different kind of ache in his chest, one that had nothing to do with anger or greed. He had spent years building walls of steel and hiring men with guns to protect what was his, but he realized that none of that mattered if there wasn't a soul at the center of the house to keep it warm. He looked at Elena, really seeing the way she poured her very life into those two children. And he felt his own icy resolve begin to thaw. He had told her she belonged to the house because she was a target, a piece of property he needed to guard. But as he watched her rock his children back to sleep in the middle of a dark, storm-tossed night, he realized he was lying to himself. He didn't just want her there for the children's safety. He wanted her there because she was the only light he had ever allowed into his world. The twins' cries eventually faded into soft, congested snuffles. Their grip on Elena's shirt loosened as the fever finally began to break, lured away by the steady, calming presence of the woman who refused to leave them. Elena's head drifted back against the side of the crib, her eyes fluttering shut as sleep finally claimed her, even as she kept her arms locked around the babies. Dante stepped out of the shadows, his boots silent on the thick carpet. He stood over them for a long time, his shadow falling over the trio. He reached down, his large hand hesitating before he gently tucked a stray, soot-tinted hair behind Elena's ear. She didn't wake, but she leaned instinctively into his touch. Dante pulled his hand back, his heart heavy with a new, dangerous realization. He wasn't just keeping her captive anymore. He was falling for the girl who had saved his soul by saving his children. The peace of the glass fortress lasted only as long as it took for the scent of smoke to fade. A week after the fever broke, a bright red sports car screamed up the driveway, its tires screeching against the gravel. Sophia Moretti stepped out, draped in a fur coat that cost more than Elena's family had earned in a decade. She didn't look like a woman who had fled her children in a fire. She looked like a queen returning to claim her throne. She walked through the front doors as if she still owned the air inside the house, her eyes scanning the foyer with a mixture of boredom and greed. Elena was in the sunroom, helping Leo take his first shaky steps while Mia played with a wooden block on the rug. When Sophia entered, the room seemed to turn cold. The twins, usually so bubbly and loud, went quiet. They didn't recognize the woman in the high heels and heavy perfume. To them, she was just a beautiful stranger who smelled like chemicals and coldness. Sophia's eyes landed on Elena, and her lip curled in a sneer. She didn't ask how the children were. She didn't ask about the night of the attack. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger at a smudge of baby food on Elena's shoulder. She laughed, a sharp, metallic sound, and asked why the hired help was still lounging on the expensive furniture. She told Elena to get up and fetch her a drink, speaking to her as if she were a piece of dirt stuck to the bottom of her shoe. She made it clear that now that the trouble was over, she was back to take her place as the lady of the house, and she wanted the filthy little maid gone by dinner. Elena stood up, her face burning with shame. She looked down at her simple clothes, and then at the radiant woman in front of her. For a moment, all the old doubts came rushing back. She was just a girl from the streets. She didn't belong in this world of diamonds and death. She began to stammer an apology, her hand instinctively reaching for the twins to say goodbye, but a heavy shadow fell across the doorway. Dante was standing there, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were burning with a white-hot rage that made Sophia's sneer falter. Sophia tried to play the part of the loving wife, rushing toward him with a fake smile, talking about how much she had missed him and how she was ready to discuss her rightful allowance and her return to the social scene. Dante didn't move. He didn't even look at her. He walked past his wife as if she were invisible and stopped right in front of Elena. He placed a steady, firm hand on Elena's shoulder, a gesture of public alignment that sent a shockwave through the room. "You're mistaken, Sophia," Dante said, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous edge. He looked at his wife then, his gaze so cold it seemed to pin her to the wall. He told her that she had lost the right to call herself a mother the second she drove away, while her children were screaming in the dark. He told her that a mother isn't someone who shares a bloodline, it's someone who stays when the world is burning. Sophia began to scream about her status and her rights, her voice rising in a desperate, ugly pitch. She called Elena a nothing and a servant. Dante cut her off with a single look. He told her that Elena was the only reason his children were still breathing. He announced, loud enough for the guards in the hall to hear, that Elena was no longer the maid. She was the heart of the home, and anyone who didn't show her the respect she deserved would have to answer to him personally. He called for his security team and ordered them to escort Sophia off the property. He made it clear that if she ever stepped foot on his land again, she would be treated as an intruder, not a guest. As the guards led a sobbing, cursing Sophia away, the house fell into a profound silence. Dante turned back to Elena. He didn't let go of her shoulder. He looked down at her, his expression softening just enough for her to see the truth. He didn't see a maid. He saw the woman who had saved him, and for the first time, Elena felt like she finally had a home that no one could take away from her. The invitation arrived not as a card, but as a row of velvet boxes delivered by the city's most exclusive tailors. Dante had decided that the world needed to see the woman who had replaced Sophia at his side. But Elena felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She spent her days in soft cotton leggings and oversized sweaters, smelling of baby powder and warm milk. The idea of stepping into the spotlight of a high society gala felt like walking onto a battlefield without armor. She told Dante she didn't belong there, that the elite would see right through her, but he simply looked at her with that unyielding gaze and told her that he was the one who decided who belonged. The transformation took hours. Professional stylists scrubbed the soot of the past weeks from her skin and polished her until she glowed. They dressed her in a gown of midnight blue silk that fit like a second skin, the fabric shimmering like the deep ocean under the moonlight. When they finally stepped back, Elena didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. Mikia's her hair was swept up in an elegant, effortless coil, and a diamond necklace, a gift from Dante, rested against her collarbone like a promise of protection. She looked powerful, elegant, and untouchable. When she walked down the grand staircase of the safe house, Dante was waiting at the bottom. For the first time since she had known him, the boss looked truly stunned. He didn't speak. He just reached out and took her hand, his thumb grazing the back of her knuckles. He leaned in and whispered that she was the most beautiful thing in his world, and for a moment the fear vanished, replaced by a heat that made her breath catch. The gala was held in a massive ballroom filled with the scent of lilies and expensive champagne. Every head turned as they entered. And these were the people who had spent years ignoring Elena when she passed them with a tray of appetizers or a vacuum cleaner. Now they were forced to move aside as Dante led her through the crowd. He kept his hand firmly on the small of her back, a possessive gesture that told everyone she was under his personal shadow. The whispers started immediately. Elena could hear the snide comments from women in silk dresses and the curious murmurs from men in tuxedos. They called her a social climber and a lucky servant. Sophia's friends gathered in a corner, their eyes sharp with malice, waiting for her to make a mistake, to trip over her dress, or to use the wrong fork. They wanted to see the maid fail. Dante sensed her tension. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear as they stood in the center of the room. He told her to keep her head high. He reminded her that she had saved 2 lives while these people were busy gossiping about hemlines. He told her she was more of a queen than any woman in the room because she had a heart they couldn't buy. Suddenly, a wealthy investor approached them, trying to bait Elena with a question about her background and her family's lineage. Elena felt the old panic rise, but then she looked at Dante. She saw the pride in his eyes and the way he stood ready to burn the room down if anyone truly hurt her. She took a steady breath and looked the man directly in the eye. She didn't lie about her past. She told him that she knew the value of hard work and loyalty, things that didn't seem to be for sale in a ballroom like this. The investor went silent, stunned by her blunt honesty. Dante let out a low, rare chuckle and pulled her closer. By the end of the night, the whispers hadn't stopped, but the tone had changed. They weren't looking at a maid anymore. They were looking at the woman who had tamed the most dangerous man in the city. As they left the gala and stepped into the cool night air, Elena realized the transformation was complete. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a force, and she was exactly where she was meant to be. The high of the gala felt like a dream that was destined to end in a nightmare. A few nights later, the air was unseasonably warm as Dante and Elena stood on the glass balcony of the penthouse. For a rare moment, the guards were stationed at the perimeter, giving them a small pocket of privacy. The twins were asleep inside, and the city lights twinkled below them like fallen stars. Dante was standing close, his hand resting on the railing next to hers, his voice lower and softer than she had ever heard it. He was talking about a future that didn't involve hiding, a life where they could take the children to a beach far away from the blood and the business. Elena watched the way the moonlight caught the sharp angles of his face. She felt a strange peace, a sense that the maid she used to be was finally gone. But then, she saw it. A tiny, rhythmic flash of red light danced across the lapel of Dante's black shirt. It was a laser sight, steady and cold, centered right over his heart. Her body moved before her mind could process the terror. She didn't scream. There wasn't time. She lunged forward, throwing her weight into Dante's chest to shove him toward the stone pillar of the balcony. The crack of the sniper rifle was muffled by a silencer, sounding like nothing more than a heavy textbook hitting a floor, but the impact was violent. Elena felt a white-hot iron sear through the meat of her upper arm. The force of the bullet spun her around, and she hit the glass floor with a sickening thud. Dante tumbled with her, his instincts taking over as he shielded her body with his own, rolling them both behind the thick marble balustrade, just as a second round shattered the glass table where they had been standing seconds before. Elena. Dante's voice was a guttural roar, stripped of all its usual icy control. He saw the dark blood blooming across the blue silk of her dress, staining the fabric he had admired only hours before. His face transformed. The man she had seen softening over baby bottles and lullabies vanished, replaced by a monster that the underworld feared for a reason. He didn't wait for his security team to arrive. He pulled a compact weapon from a hidden holster at his back, his eyes fixed on the rooftop across the street with a predatory focus. He pressed a button on his radio, his voice a terrifying whisper that promised death to anyone listening. He ordered a total lockdown and a scorched earth hunt for the shooter. Elena reached out with her good arm, her fingers trembling as she grabbed the cuff of his shirt. She tried to tell him she was okay, that the wound was shallow, but the pain was making her dizzy. Dante looked down at her, and for a second, the rage in his eyes flickered into a pure, raw agony. He saw her blood on his hands, the blood of the only person who had ever loved him without a contract. When the guards finally burst onto the balcony, Dante stood up. He didn't look like a boss. He looked like a god of war. He barked orders to get the medic, his voice shaking with a fury so intense that the veteran soldiers flinched. He told them that if the assassin wasn't brought to him alive within the hour, he would burn the city to the ground. He knelt back down, scooping Elena into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He ignored the blood soaking into his own shirt, his jaw set so tight it looked like it might snap. He carried her inside, past the crying twins who had been woken by the commotion, and didn't let anyone else touch her. As he laid her on the bed, he leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers. He whispered a vow that he would never let another shadow touch her, and that everyone involved in tonight's hit would pray for a quick death. Elena closed her eyes, realizing that while she had saved his life again, she had also unleashed a version of Dante Moretti that the world wasn't ready to face. The medicine made the edges of the room feel soft and blurry, but the pain in Elena's arm remained a dull, steady throb that kept her tethered to reality. The penthouse was silent, a heavy, watchful quiet that felt different from the usual tension of the Moretti household. Outside the bedroom door, she knew a small army was standing guard, but inside, the only light came from the glowing embers in the fireplace and the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. Dante was sitting in a chair pulled close to the edge of the bed. He had washed the blood from his hands, but he hadn't changed his clothes. The dark stains on his shirt were a grim reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. This was a man who commanded thousands, a man who decided who lived and died with a flick of his pen. Yet in the shadows of the sick room, he looked smaller, more human. Elena shifted slightly, a small gasp of pain escaping her lips. In an instant, Dante was on his feet, his hand hovering over hers as if he were afraid to touch her and break what was left. He asked if she needed the doctor, his voice thick with a gravelly desperation. Elena shook her head slowly and reached out, her fingers brushing the rough fabric of his sleeve. She told him she was fine, that it was just a scratch, but they both knew that wasn't the truth. The bullet had been meant for him, and the weight of that reality sat between them like a physical wall. Dante sat on the edge of the mattress, in the weight of him making the bed sink. He didn't look at her. He looked at the far wall, his jaw tight. He began to speak, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. He told her about the life he had lived before she arrived, a life that was nothing but a series of battles and cold rooms. He admitted that he had married Sophia because it was expected, a business arrangement to merge two powerful names. He had never expected to feel anything for the children, viewing them more as heirs to be protected than lives to be loved. Then he looked at her. His eyes were raw, stripped of the armor he wore for the world. He told her that the night of the fire, he hadn't just found his children. He had found a version of the world he didn't think existed. He saw a woman with nothing to gain and everything to lose standing in the flames for people who weren't even her own blood. He admitted that at first he had kept her there because he was selfish. He needed the twins to be safe, and she was the only one he could trust. But then his voice broke, a sound that sent a jolt through Elena's heart. He told her that as the weeks passed, the house stopped feeling like a fortress and started feeling like a home. He found himself looking for her in every room, listening for her laugh, and feeling a strange, terrifying warmth whenever she looked at him. He confessed that he didn't just need a guardian for his children or someone to manage his household. He didn't need a maid, and he didn't need a contract. "I need you, Elena," he whispered, his hand finally closing over hers, his grip tight and trembling. "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who want something from me. You're the only person who ever gave me everything without asking for a single thing in return." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers in the dark. He told her that he was a dangerous man with a soul full of scars, and that loving him was a risk he had no right to ask her to take. But he said he couldn't imagine a world where she wasn't by his side. For the first time, the power dynamic between them shifted. He wasn't the boss claiming his property. He was a man begging for a reason to keep fighting. Elena pulled him closer, her heart full of a terrifying, beautiful hope. The dark wasn't so scary anymore because, for the first time, they were facing it together. The transition happened not with a coronation, but with a quiet understanding that settled over the Moretti estate like a blanket of fresh snow. Elena's arm was still in a sling, a physical reminder of the price she was willing to pay for her family, but she no longer walked the halls with the hesitant steps of a servant. She had traded her gray cotton uniform for tailored silk and soft cashmere, yet the fire in her eyes remained the same one that had burned through the smoke on the night of the attack. The grand dining room, once a cold and hollow space used only for silent meals or tense business meetings, was now filled with the sounds of life. Leo and Mia were older now, their laughter echoing off the marble walls as they chased each other around the long mahogany table. Dante sat at the head, but he was no longer a solitary king in a lonely castle. He watched Elena with a look of steady, quiet devotion that made the rest of the world feel miles away. The underworld had watched the change with a mixture of confusion and fear. They had seen the poor maid transform into something they didn't know how to handle. She wasn't a socialite who cared about jewelry or gossip, and she wasn't a soldier who cared about turf wars. She was something far more dangerous, a woman who protected her own with a ferocity that even the most hardened hitmen respected. The turning point came during a high-level summit held at the estate. The leaders of the city's most powerful families had gathered to discuss the fallout from the failed assassination attempt. They expected to see Dante Moretti alone, ready to trade blood for peace. Instead, they found Elena standing by his side. When one of the older bosses tried to dismiss her, suggesting that the help should leave the room so the men could talk, the temperature in the room plummeted. Dante didn't have to say a word. He simply leaned back and looked at Elena. She didn't flinch. She looked the old man in the eye and calmly explained that she knew every secret of this house, every vulnerability of the staff, and every heartbeat of the heirs. She told them that any threat to the Moretti name was a threat to her, and she had already proven she was willing to bleed for it. The room went silent. In that moment, the men realized that Elena wasn't just a guest or a lover. She was the anchor. She was the one who kept the boss grounded and the heirs safe. One by one, the bosses dipped their heads in a sign of respect that had previously been reserved only for Dante. The woman who used to polish their shoes was now the woman who held the keys to the kingdom. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were tucked into bed, Elena stood on the balcony where the nightmare had almost claimed them. Dante walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He whispered that the city was finally quiet because they were afraid of her. Elena leaned her head back against his shoulder, looking out over the lights of the city she had once struggled to survive in. She realized she wasn't the poor maid anymore, and she wasn't just a survivor. She was the heart of a legacy. She had walked through the fire to save 2 children, and in the process, she had built a fortress that no one could tear down. She had found her place, not as a servant or a captive, but as the matriarch of the most powerful family in the city. The war wasn't over. It never truly was in their world, but as long as they stood together, she knew they had already won.